The morning fog hung thick over Southie like a grey wool blanket, the kind that made the old Irish women pull their shawls tighter as they walked to morning mass at St. Brigid's. Tommy Sullivan stood at the window of his triple-decker on O Street, watching the harbour through the mist while his coffee grew cold in his hands. It was October 15th, 2008, and at 43 years old, Tommy had learned to read the signs in his neighbourhood, the way his grandfather had read the Atlantic swells from the docks. Something was shifting in South Boston, something that would soon tear through the Sullivan family like a nor'easter through fishing nets. Tommy's wife Marie was in the kitchen, packing lunch for their daughter Colleen, who at 17 had inherited her mother's auburn hair and her father's stubborn streak. The smell of bacon filled their narrow kitchen while Marie hummed an old Clancy Brothers tune, unaware that this would be the last normal morning their family would ever know. Colleen bounded down the stairs in her Boston Latin Academy uniform, her backpack slung over one shoulder, complaining about her chemistry test while grabbing a piece of toast from her mother's plate. "You better ace that test, kiddo," Tommy said, not turning from the window. "Your old man didn't break his back on construction sites for 20 years, so you could slack off in school." But there was warmth in his voice, the kind of gruff affection that ran deep in working-class Irish families. Colleen kissed his cheek and promised to call after school, a promise that would haunt Tommy for years to come. The Sullivan family had deep roots in Southie, going back to Tommy's great-grandfather, who had arrived from County Cork in 1923 with nothing but a suitcase and a letter of introduction to a dock foreman. 4 generations later, the Sullivans were still there, still fighting for their piece of the American dream in a neighborhood that had seen its share of struggles. Tommy worked construction, Marie cleaned offices downtown, and together they had managed to keep their family afloat even as drugs and violence crept into the corners of their community like floodwater seeping through basement walls. By noon that October day, the fog had lifted to reveal a crisp autumn sky, the kind that made you believe anything was possible. Marie was at her second job at the State Street office building, running a vacuum over corporate carpets, while lawyers and bankers made more in an hour than she made in a week. Tommy was on a job site in Back Bay, framing out luxury condos that he could never afford to live in, and Colleen was supposed to be in chemistry class. But at 12:47 p.m., she had stepped out of Boston Latin Academy to meet someone who had promised her information about college scholarships. The man who approached Colleen outside the school introduced himself as Miguel Santos, claiming to work for a non-profit that helped inner-city kids get into college. He was well-dressed, articulate, and carried what appeared to be legitimate paperwork. What Colleen didn't know was that Santos worked for Eduardo Vega, a mid-level drug distributor who was expanding his operation from Roxbury into South Boston. What she also didn't know was that Vega had been watching the Sullivan family for weeks, identifying Tommy as someone who might be useful to his organization, someone with the right connections and the right desperation that comes from raising a family on a construction worker's salary. The plan was simple in its cruelty. Take the daughter, leverage the father, expand the territory. Vega had used variations of this strategy in Mattapan and Dorchester, finding that family men were often more reliable than street soldiers because they had something real to lose. But Vega had miscalculated badly when he chose the Sullivans. He had seen an aging construction worker and assumed weakness. He had not accounted for the fact that Tommy Sullivan came from a long line of men who had survived potato famines, Fenian raids, and Boston police corruption. He had not considered that desperation could cut both ways. At 3:15 p.m., when Colleen failed to come home from school, Marie called Tommy at the job site. Her voice was tight with the kind of worry that every parent knows, but hopes never to feel. Tommy left work immediately, driving his battered Ford pickup through the streets of South Boston while calling Colleen's friends, her teachers, anyone who might have seen her. By 5:30 p.m., they had called the Boston Police Department, though both Tommy and Marie knew that a missing teenager in the city was often just another file in an overworked detective's caseload. Detective Ray Morrison took the report at District C6, the same station where Tommy's father had once reported a robbery back in 1975. Morrison was a 20-year veteran who had seen enough missing persons cases to know the statistics by heart. Most teenagers who disappeared in Boston turned up within 48 hours, usually staying with friends or acting out against their parents. But something about the way Tommy Sullivan's hands shook as he filled out the paperwork told Morrison this case might be different. The first 24 hours passed like a slow hemorrhage, with Tommy and Marie making phone calls, walking the streets, and posting flyers with Colleen's school photo on every telephone pole in a 10-block radius. Their neighbors rallied around them with the fierce loyalty that still existed in pockets of old Southie, organizing search parties and manning phone trees. Mrs. O'Brien from next door brought casseroles that no one could eat. Father McKenna from St. Bridget's led prayer vigils that felt more like war councils. On October 17th, at exactly 9:22 a.m., Tommy's cell phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. The voice on the other end spoke with a slight accent, polite but cold. "Mr. Sullivan, my name is Eduardo Vega, and I have something that belongs to you." The words hit Tommy like a punch to the solar plexus, stealing his breath and making the world tilt sideways. "Your daughter is safe for now, but whether she stays safe depends entirely on your cooperation." Vega's demands were straightforward. Tommy was to use his construction connections to help move product through South Boston, providing safe houses and transportation in exchange for his daughter's eventual return. The alternative, Vega explained in the patient tone of a man who had made this speech before, was that Colleen would simply disappear forever into the network of trafficking routes that stretched from Boston to Miami to Mexico City. Tommy listened to Vega's terms while Marie watched his face change from hope to horror to something harder and more dangerous. When the call ended, Tommy sat in their kitchen for a full minute without speaking, his hands flat on the table where Colleen had eaten breakfast 2 days earlier. Then he looked at his wife and said the words that would define the rest of their lives. "We're going to get her back, Marie, whatever it takes." But Tommy Sullivan was not the kind of man who made deals with drug dealers, not even to save his daughter's life. Instead, he began to make other kinds of calls, reaching out to men he had known since childhood, men who understood that some lines could not be crossed without consequences. His brother Patrick, who had done 2 tours in Iraq with the Marines, his cousin Danny, who worked private security and still had contacts in law enforcement, his old friend Mickey Rowan, who ran a moving company and knew every back alley and warehouse in South Boston. What Tommy was planning went against every instinct he had developed as a law-abiding citizen, but it aligned perfectly with something deeper and older, something that went back to the hills of County Cork, where his ancestors had learned that sometimes justice came not from courts and constables, but from men willing to take risks for the people they loved. Over the next week, while maintaining the appearance of cooperation with Vega's organization, Tommy began to assemble what would later be called by Boston Police Detective Ray Morrison the most methodical and devastating vigilante campaign in the city's history. The first target was Miguel Santos, the man who had lured Colleen away from school. Tommy and Patrick found him at a bar in Roxbury on October 24th, exactly 9 days after Colleen's disappearance. They didn't torture him for information, though the temptation was there. Instead, Patrick used techniques he had learned in military intelligence to extract what they needed to know. Santos broke after 20 minutes, providing addresses, names, and organizational details that painted a picture of Vega's operation, stretching across 3 states. Santos was found the next morning behind the bar, beaten badly enough to require hospitalization, but alive enough to deliver a message to his associates. The message was simple. The Sullivans were coming, and they were not interested in negotiations. By Halloween night, 2 more of Vega's distributors had been hospitalized, both of them providing additional intelligence about the network that held Colleen somewhere in its web of safe houses and trafficking routes. Eduardo Vega made his first serious mistake on November 3rd when he decided to escalate the situation by having Tommy's construction site vandalized and threatening Marie at her cleaning job. What Vega still didn't understand was that he was not dealing with a desperate father who could be intimidated into submission. He was dealing with a man who had already crossed the line from victim to predator, who had tasted violence and found it surprisingly satisfying when applied in service of love. The response came on November 7th when Vega's Lieutenant Carlos Mendez disappeared from a nightclub in Dorchester. Unlike the previous attacks, which had been designed to gather information, this one was different. Mendez was found 3 days later in Boston Harbor, sending a clear message that the rules of engagement had changed. Detective Morrison later described this as the moment when a missing persons case became something much darker and more complex. Tommy's campaign was methodical in a way that impressed even seasoned investigators. Rather than striking randomly, he and his growing circle of allies moved up the organizational chart with surgical precision, each target providing intelligence that led to the next level of Vega's operation. Patrick Sullivan's military training proved invaluable in planning operations that looked like gang violence to outside observers, but followed tactical principles that would have been familiar to any Special Forces commander. By Thanksgiving, 7 members of Vega's organization had been either killed or hospitalized, and the drug lord was beginning to realize that he had made a catastrophic error in judgment. The Irish construction worker and his family were not backing down, and they seemed to have resources and capabilities that went far beyond what Vega had anticipated. More troubling still, other criminal organizations in Boston were taking notice, some offering support to the Sullivans, while others distanced themselves from Vega to avoid being caught in what was clearly becoming a war. Colleen herself was moved repeatedly during this period, shifted from a warehouse in Chelsea to an apartment in Lynn, to a house in Lawrence, as Vega tried to stay ahead of Tommy's increasingly sophisticated intelligence network. She was not physically harmed during her captivity, though the psychological damage of being held for weeks by men who spoke casually about killing her father accumulated like sediment in her mind. Years later, she would describe this time as living in a nightmare where every day might be the day they decided I wasn't useful anymore. The break in the case came from an unexpected source. Maria Santos, Miguel's sister, worked as a cleaning lady in the same State Street building where Marie Sullivan had a night shift. On December 12th, driven by guilt over her brother's role in Colleen's abduction, Maria approached Marie in a supply closet on the 34th floor and whispered an address in Lawrence where she thought the girl might be held. It was a moment of human decency that cut across ethnic and class lines, one woman helping another in a situation that transcended the usual boundaries of urban life. Tommy and Patrick surveilled the Lawrence address for 3 days, using techniques that Patrick had learned in urban warfare environments. They identified patterns of movement, noted the number of guards, and developed what military strategists call situational awareness of the target environment. On December 15th, exactly 2 months after Colleen's disappearance, they moved. The rescue operation lasted 7 minutes from start to finish. Patrick entered through a rear window, while Tommy and Danny Rowan created a distraction at the front of the house. 2 of Vega's men were killed in the ensuing firefight, and a third was critically wounded. But when the smoke cleared, Tommy was carrying his daughter out of a basement room where she had been held for 8 weeks, and for the first time since October 15th, he allowed himself to believe that his family might survive this nightmare. But Eduardo Vega was not the kind of man who accepted defeat gracefully. On December 18th, 3 days after Colleen's rescue, he made his second and final mistake by ordering a retaliatory attack on the Sullivan home. The gunmen arrived at 2:30 a.m., expecting to find a sleeping family easy to eliminate. Instead, they found Tommy and Patrick waiting with military-grade weapons and the kind of tactical preparation that comes from men who have learned that survival requires the willingness to do terrible things to terrible people. The firefight in South Boston woke half the neighborhood and brought 17 police units to O Street. When the shooting stopped, 4 of Vega's men were dead, and Eduardo Vega himself was wounded badly enough that he died in an ambulance on the way to Boston Medical Center. The war that had started with the abduction of a 17-year-old girl had ended with gunfire in the streets of South Boston, leaving a body count that would take investigators months to fully catalogue. Detective Ray Morrison spent the rest of the winter interviewing witnesses, analysing evidence, and trying to piece together exactly what had happened during those 2 months when the Sullivan family had declared their own private war on Boston's drug trade. The official investigation identified 15 deaths that could be directly or indirectly linked to the conflict, though Morrison suspected the actual number was higher when peripheral violence and related gang activity were taken into account. The legal aftermath was complex in ways that reflected the moral ambiguity of the situation. Tommy Sullivan was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, assault, and weapons violations. But public sympathy was overwhelmingly on his side, particularly in South Boston, where residents saw him as a father who had done what any decent man would do to save his daughter. The district attorney's office found itself in the unusual position of prosecuting a man who was viewed by many as a hero rather than a criminal. The trial began in September 2009 and lasted 6 weeks, with testimony that painted a picture of a father driven to extremes by circumstances that would have tested any parent's limits. Tommy's defense attorney, Margaret O'Sullivan, argued that her client had acted in self-defense and in defense of his family, pointing out that the police investigation had failed to locate Colleen, despite having the same information that Tommy had eventually gathered through his own efforts. Patrick Sullivan was also charged, though his military record and the testimony of fellow veterans who spoke about the bonds between soldiers resonated with jurors who understood the concept of loyalty that transcends legal boundaries. Danny Rowan and Mickey Rowan faced lesser charges, though their involvement in the campaign was clearly established through phone records and witness testimony. The prosecution, led by Assistant District Attorney Jennifer Walsh, argued that the Sullivans had taken the law into their own hands and created a cycle of violence that had terrorized the city for 2 months. She pointed out that 15 people had died, including several who were peripherally involved in Vega's organization and who might have been saved if the Sullivans had worked within the legal system rather than launching their own private war. On November 15, 2009, exactly 13 months after Colleen's abduction, the jury returned mixed verdicts that reflected the complexity of the case. Tommy was convicted of voluntary manslaughter in 3 deaths, but acquitted of the most serious murder charges. Patrick was convicted of assault and weapons violations, but acquitted of murder. The sentences ranged from 18 months to 8 years. With the judge acknowledging in his remarks that the case represented an extraordinary situation where ordinary people were driven to extraordinary measures by circumstances that tested the limits of human endurance. Colleen Sullivan testified at her father's trial, describing her 8 weeks in captivity and her belief that she would have been killed if her family had not acted to save her. Her testimony was devastating in its quiet intensity, particularly when she described overhearing her captors discussing plans to eliminate her once her father had served his usefulness to their organization. The courtroom was silent as she spoke about the moment when she heard her father's voice calling her name in that basement in Lawrence, a sound she described as the most beautiful thing I had ever heard in my life. Marie Sullivan never testified at the trial, but she attended every day of the proceedings, sitting in the front row behind the defense table with the same fierce determination that had sustained her through those months of uncertainty. She told reporters that she supported her husband completely and would do the same thing if faced with similar circumstances. When asked if she regretted the violence that had resulted from their actions, she paused for a long moment before saying, "I regret that it was necessary, but I don't regret that it happened." The Sullivan case became a touchstone for discussions about vigilante justice, parental rights, and the limits of law enforcement in situations involving organized crime. Law professors debated the moral and legal implications for years afterward, while crime statistics showed a measurable decrease in drug-related activity in South Boston during the months following Vega's death, suggesting that the Sullivans' campaign had achieved at least some of its intended deterrent effect. Tommy served 4 years of his 8-year sentence, being released in 2013 for good behavior and participation in prison education programs. Patrick served 18 months and returned to South Boston to work in his brother's construction business, which had somehow survived the legal and financial challenges of the preceding years. The other family members and friends who had been involved served shorter sentences or were placed on probation, with most resuming their previous lives with remarkably little fanfare. Colleen Sullivan graduated from Boston Latin Academy in 2009, despite having missed most of her senior year due to the trial and its aftermath. She received a full scholarship to Boston College, majoring in criminal justice with a focus on victim advocacy. In interviews years later, she would describe her experience as traumatic, but ultimately strengthening, saying that it had taught her the difference between justice and revenge, and the importance of having people in your life who are willing to risk everything for your safety. The long-term consequences of the Sullivan case extended far beyond the immediate family. Detective Ray Morrison was promoted to sergeant and eventually became a specialist in cases involving organized crime and family violence. He would often cite the Sullivan case in training seminars, using it as an example of how quickly ordinary citizens can be drawn into violent confrontations with criminal organizations, and how important it is for law enforcement to respond quickly and effectively to kidnapping and extortion cases. Father McKenna at St. Bridget's Church conducted a memorial service for all the victims of the violence, including members of Vega's organization, reflecting his belief that every life had value, regardless of the choices people had made. The service was controversial in the community, with some parishioners arguing that drug dealers deserved no sympathy, even in death. But McKenna's sermon about forgiveness and redemption resonated with many who had been touched by the violence, including some members of the Sullivan family who were struggling with the moral weight of what they had done. The neighborhood itself was changed by the events, though in subtle ways that became apparent only over time. Property values in South Boston actually increased in the years following the violence, as prospective residents viewed it as a community where families were protected and criminal activity was not tolerated. But there was also an underlying tension that had not existed before, an awareness that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary violence when pushed beyond their limits. Maria Santos, the cleaning lady who had provided the crucial information about Colleen's location, moved to Providence with her family after receiving death threats from associates of Vega's organization who blamed her for his downfall. She was placed in a witness protection program for 6 months. though she ultimately chose to return to the Boston area where she found work with a cleaning company that specialized in office buildings in the financial district. Eduardo Vega's criminal organization fragmented after his death, with various lieutenants attempting to claim control over different aspects of his drug distribution network. The resulting power struggle led to additional violence throughout 2009 and into 2010, as competing groups fought for territory and control over trafficking routes. Boston police estimated that the collapse of Vega's organization was directly or indirectly responsible for at least 8 additional deaths and dozens of arrests over the subsequent 2 years. The weapons used in the Sullivan campaign were never fully recovered, though police found several firearms in a storage unit rented by Patrick Sullivan under an assumed name. The military-grade equipment that had been used in some of the operations suggested connections to veteran networks that law enforcement was never able to fully trace, leading to ongoing investigations into the illegal weapons trade among former military personnel. By 2015, 10 years after Colleen's abduction, the Sullivan family had achieved a kind of normalcy that would have seemed impossible during those dark months of 2008 and 2009. Tommy had remarried to a woman he had met in a support group for families of crime victims, though he and Marie had divorced amicably in 2012, both acknowledging that the trauma they had shared had ultimately driven them apart, rather than bringing them closer together. Colleen had graduated from Boston College and was working for a non-profit organization that provided legal assistance to victims of trafficking and organized crime. She had married a fellow social worker she met during graduate school and was raising 2 children in a suburb west of Boston, far enough from South Boston to feel safe, but close enough to maintain connections with the community that had supported her family during their crisis. Patrick Sullivan had struggled more with the aftermath of the violence, developing post-traumatic stress disorder that was complicated by his military service and the intense nature of the campaign against Vega's organization. He had undergone extensive counseling and had become an advocate for veteran mental health services, speaking to groups about the challenges of readjusting to civilian life after experiencing combat, whether in military or civilian contexts. Detective Ray Morrison retired from the Boston Police Department in 2018 after a career that included investigations into some of the city's most notorious crimes. He often spoke about the Sullivan case as an example of how quickly ordinary citizens can be drawn into extraordinary circumstances, and how important it is for law enforcement to understand the community dynamics that drive people to take matters into their own hands. The house on O Street, where the final confrontation had taken place, was eventually sold to a young family who knew nothing of its history when they moved in. The new owners renovated extensively, removing bullet holes and replacing windows that had been shattered during the gun battle. But older residents of the neighborhood still pointed it out to visitors as the place where Tommy Sullivan made his stand against the drug dealers who had taken his daughter. In 2020, 12 years after the abduction that had started everything, Colleen Sullivan published a memoir titled Taken, a daughter's story of survival and justice that became a bestseller and was eventually adapted into a Netflix documentary series. The book provided the most complete account of her experience during the 8 weeks she was held captive, as well as her perspective on the violence that her father and uncle had unleashed in response to her abduction. The memoir was controversial for its nuanced portrayal of both the victims and perpetrators of the violence, with Colleen arguing that while she understood and supported her family's actions, she had also come to believe that the cycle of violence had created more victims than it had saved. She wrote movingly about meeting the families of some of the men who had been killed in her father's campaign, and her struggle to reconcile her gratitude for her rescue with her awareness of the human cost of that rescue. Tommy Sullivan, by then in his 50s and working as a construction supervisor for a firm that specialized in historic renovations, gave several interviews to promote his daughter's book. He was careful to say that he did not regret his actions, but that he hoped other families would never face the choices that had been forced upon his family. When asked if he would do the same thing again, he paused for a long moment before saying, "I hope I never have to find out." The broader implications of the Sullivan case continued to resonate in academic and policy circles well into the 2020s. Criminologists studied it as an example of how organized crime victimizes ordinary families and how those families respond when conventional law enforcement fails to provide adequate protection. Civil liberties advocates pointed to it as evidence of the dangers of vigilante justice, while victims' rights groups cited it as an example of what happens when the justice system fails to protect innocent people. Law enforcement agencies incorporated lessons from the Sullivan case into their training programs, particularly regarding the importance of rapid response to kidnapping cases involving organized crime. The FBI developed new protocols for coordinating with local police departments in situations where criminal organizations target ordinary citizens for leverage or intimidation, recognizing that the window for preventing vigilante responses is often measured in hours rather than days. The neighborhood of South Boston itself continued to evolve throughout the 2010s and into the 2020s, with gentrification bringing new residents who were largely unaware of the violence that had taken place there more than a decade earlier. But the older residents remembered, and the story of the Sullivan family became part of the unofficial history of the community, passed down through family stories and neighborhood gatherings as an example of what could happen when ordinary people were pushed beyond their limits. Marie Sullivan, who had never remarried after her divorce from Tommy, became a victim advocate specializing in families affected by organized crime. She worked with the district attorney's office to develop better protocols for protecting family members of kidnapping victims, and she testified before the state legislature in support of legislation that would provide additional resources for families facing extortion or intimidation by criminal organizations. The legacy of those 2 months in 2008 and 2009 was complex and multifaceted, touching the lives of hundreds of people in ways both obvious and subtle. For the Sullivan family, it was a story of survival and love that had exacted a terrible price, transforming ordinary people into something harder and more dangerous than they had ever imagined they could become. For the community of South Boston, it was a reminder that the line between victim and perpetrator could be crossed more easily than anyone wanted to believe. And for the city of Boston as a whole, it became a case study in the limits of law enforcement and the power of family bonds to drive people to actions that transcended legal and moral boundaries. The 15 deaths that resulted from Eduardo Vega's decision to abduct Colleen Sullivan served as a stark reminder that in a world where criminal organizations prey on innocent families, sometimes justice comes not from courts and judges, but from ordinary people who refuse to accept that their loved ones are expendable in someone else's business plan.